Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to explore the strange and fascinating roots behind one of the most popular mythological worlds in modern storytelling, the Norse universe of God of War. If you've never looked into the myths behind the game, you might be surprised at how much of it comes directly from the Old Norse sagas and how much was changed, twisted, or completely reimagined. The Norse myths are full of gods who are far from perfect. They fight, lie, and make terrible mistakes. Odin seeks endless knowledge but never peace. Thor is both hero and bully. Loki shifts between ally and destroyer, and in the middle of it all is the prophecy of Ragnarok, the end of everything. The world of God of War takes these myths and gives them a new shape, blending ancient legends with modern emotion. A story about fathers, sons, and the heavy cost of power. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you. Whether you're here to unwind or just love a good story about gods and chaos, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. In the twilight of the world, beneath the endless grey skies of Midgard, a god once drenched in the blood of Olympus lived as a man. Kratos, who had slain kings and titans, had built a small life among the whispering pines and snow-covered hills. The house he shared with Faye and their son Atreus stood at the edge of the wilderness, where smoke curled lazily from the chimney and the air carried the scent of pine resin and ash. When Faye died, that smoke became an offering. Her pyre burned bright against the cold. Kratos' massive hands, scarred from centuries of violence, trembled as he placed her body upon the wood. Atreus stood beside him, his young face streaked with tears. The flames rose, their crackle echoing through the frozen valley like the low growl of a forgotten god. The ashes spiraled into the air, carried by a wind that seemed to whisper of something greater waiting beyond the horizon. Faye had left one final wish. Her ashes were to be scattered from the highest peak in all the realms. It was a simple request on the surface, but nothing in the 9 realms is ever truly simple. In Norse myth, mountains were more than stone and ice. They were bones of Ymir, the first giant, whose body the gods had torn apart to create the world. To climb a mountain was to walk upon the corpse of creation itself. Kratos did not yet know what that wish meant. To him, it was a promise, a task to honor the woman who had softened the edges of his rage. To Atreus, it was a quest, the first adventure of a boy eager to prove himself. The father and son set out, each with a different understanding of the journey. Atreus's childhood had been marked by illness, his frail body no match for the frozen air and harsh winters of Midgard. Yet within him stirred something older, something wild. He could read the strange runes carved into the bark of trees and speak to the ravens that watched from the branches. The old stories whispered of seers and gods who could speak to beasts, and though Kratos dismissed such talk, the boy's gift was undeniable. The gods of the north were not like the gods of Greece. The Aesir were tricksters and warriors, drunk on prophecy and deceit. Odin, the All-Father, hoarded knowledge like a miser's gold, tearing out his own eye to see beyond fate's veil. Thor, his son, wielded Mjolnir with such ferocity that mountains cracked beneath its blows. Freya, the Vanir queen, was both healer and sorceress, lover and enemy to the Aesir. In their realm of Asgard, they watched the mortal and divine alike as pieces in an endless game. When the smoke of Faye's funeral rose into the sky, it did not go unnoticed. Something ancient stirred. The air grew heavy, as though the world itself had taken a deep breath. Kratos could feel it, a shifting in the fabric of things, the faint hum of divine attention. The quiet life he had built was a fragile illusion, and the gods of this land were not fond of strangers. He prepared his son in silence. The boy carried a small knife, Faye's parting gift, while Kratos strapped on his axe, the Leviathan, a weapon forged in the age before man, humming with runes of ice. The trees loomed like sentinels as they left home, the forest watching their every step. There was reverence in Kratos' movements, but also reluctance. He had seen what quests for God's favor led to, yet to deny a promise to the dead was to invite their restlessness. As they traveled deeper into the woods, Atreus recited verses his mother had taught him, lines from the Eddas, the old poems that told of creation and doom. The ash tree Yggdrasil stands, tall and broad, its roots in the well of fate, he whispered. Kratos listened, silent but thoughtful. The words of the Norse carried the same truth he had learned from the Greeks. All stories end in blood. Their journey was a thread being tugged by unseen hands, weaving into the tapestry of fate that the Norns, the weavers of destiny, had long ago begun. Kratos did not believe in fate, yet the Norse world believed in little else. Everything was bound by prophecy, from the fall of gods to the whisper of a raven's wing. And somewhere in those tangled threads, the name of Faye, and perhaps even Kratos himself, was written. Snow fell in patient flakes that did not quite reach the ground before the wind spirited them sideways. The forest kept its own counsel. Then a knock came that was not a knock so much as a statement. It sounded once upon the door, and every bird within earshot decided it had other places to be. Kratos sent Atreus inside with a glance. The boy knew the look. He vanished behind the leather curtain, and the house seemed to hold its breath. On the threshold stood a narrow man with the air of someone who had misplaced a memory and was annoyed about it. His skin was inked with old symbols and new scars. He smiled as if the smile were a knife. He said he had heard that the man in the woods had something to hide. He said it as if he were commenting on the weather. He wished to know what Kratos was. He wished to know what the ashes on the wind had meant. He had walked here as though distance were an insult. He did not offer a name. Names have power in the north. One learns the lesson quickly or not at all. Kratos did what quiet men of violence do. He asked the stranger to leave. The stranger did not. There was a pause, like the rustle before a page turns. And then the earth learned a new language that day. It learned the grammar of fists, the syntax of stone that breaks, and the punctuation of bodies thrown through fir trunks. The man should have been pulp on the snow. He was not. His eyes were bright with a cruel curiosity. When Kratos broke his ribs, the man cocked his head and remarked on the event as though it were a painting. He said he could not feel it. He invited another blow to test the theory. Here the story of the stranger brushes against the older story of Baldur, the radiant son of Odin and Frigg. In the poems, Baldur dreams of his own death and wakes afraid. Frigg, mother and queen, goes to everything that lives and everything that does not live and asks it to swear an oath to never harm her son. Fire promises, iron promises, stone promises. The snakes in the field and the illnesses that ride unseen in the blood all promise. Frigg forgets a sprig of mistletoe that climbs unnoticed upon trees. The sprig is small, and she does not bother it. The forgetfulness becomes a hinge upon which the door of a world will swing. Back in the yard, the stranger hurled Kratos from the roof. The logs shuddered and settled. The house had endured winters and wolves. It had not endured this. The stranger laughed and said he felt nothing at all. Not cold, not heat, not the bite of bone. He wore invulnerability the way other men wear a cloak, and with it came a terrible emptiness. No taste in food, no joy in a kiss, no pain, and therefore no relief from pain. It is a very Norse sort of curse, to be denied the thing that proves you are alive. Kratos understood enough to be wary. He had met men who wanted power, and men who wanted glory. Here was a man who wanted sensation, which is more dangerous by far. He struck until the ground split and revealed the pale root of an ancient pine. He struck until the birds returned only to flee again. He struck until the stranger's neck gave beneath his hands with a sound like a green branch breaking. The body fell from a cliff and vanished into white. In the Eddic tale, Loki learns of Frigg's oversight and fashions a dart from the harmless plant. The gods, in a mood, have been throwing things at Balder for sport. Arrows glance away. Axes tumble aside. Stones skip off his shoulder like flat pebbles on a lake. Loki hands the mistletoe to Hoder, Balder's blind brother, and guides his aim. The dart flies. Balder falls. The sense of a world with a hole in it pours from the poems like smoke. The funeral is the grandest in the old stories. They place Balder upon his ship named Hringhorni, the greatest of ships. Nanna, his wife, collapses from grief and dies, and is burned with him. Thor sanctifies the pyre. A dwarf named Lit wanders too close to the flames and is kicked into the fire, which is the sort of detail that tells you these gods are terribly human after all. Odin lays upon the dead his ring Draupnir, from which other rings drip every 9th night. A small fountain of gold that now becomes a token of memory. Hermod rides Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse, down the cold road to Hel to ask for his brother's return. Hel, who is not a place but a queen, says yes if everything in the world will weep. Everything does except a single giantess in a cave named Thok. She says she has no use for Balder alive or dead. The world does not complete its weeping. The door stays shut. Some say Thok was Loki wearing a shape. The stranger who should have stayed dead did not stay dead. Later, he would climb back to the light with a snarl like a blade pulled slow from a sheath. For now, the forest kept the secret, and Kratos took the silence as a brief mercy. He went inside and told Atreus to gather what he could carry. The boy obeyed while looking everywhere at once. The walls that had made a home were now a cage. The yard that had been a sanctuary was now a stage upon which larger creatures wished to tread. There were signs that Faye had known something of this long before. Runes etched into lintel and threshold, hidden knots of birch bark tied with red thread, a scatter of dried herbs that smelled of summer. Warding is an art in the north that runs on the old logic. Name the harm, bind it with a word and a token. Bury a charm under the first stone laid for the hearth. Hang an iron blade over the door. Every item speaks to something. The spells do not say, be safe. They say, be ready. Kratos lifted the Leviathan axe from its place. The weapon held a cold that did not come from winter. Dwarven craft, whispering with enchantments. It was a piece of the older economy where gifts are never only gifts. There are obligations woven into steel and favors sleeping in metal. In the 9, realms' favors wake at awkward times. Atreus slung his quiver. The boy had questions and they arrived in a tidy line. Who was the man? Why did he come? How did he survive what should have killed him? Kratos gave spare answers. A father protects in many ways. Sometimes he gives a shield. Sometimes he gives a silence. The boy's face showed that he knew the difference and did not like it, but he accepted it for now. He burned with the sort of curiosity that ferries heroes into trouble and then out again, if they are lucky. As they left the yard, the forest altered. It is a trick of the senses that follows danger. The spruces seemed taller. The light under their arms felt green and watchful. Somewhere, a raven called twice, which in these lands is not simply a bird being a bird. Odin kept 2 such creatures, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, who fly over the world and return to his shoulder with news. The old poets make it clear that gods require intelligence as much as they require worship. The gods of this world were listeners with long shadows. The path wound toward the river where ice shifted in sheets. Atreus touched the runes that Faye had carved along the way. The boy could sound them out as if the letters liked him. The words spoke of safe crossings and the price of safe crossings. This is a standard clause in Norse life. Nothing is given. Every protection asks for something in return. Blood on a stone. Bread left on a stump. A promise made to the wind. They passed the stump where Faye had split kindling. Kratos rested a hand upon the grey wood and felt the small dent where her axe had landed again and again. Grief is not an enemy to be slain. It is a winter to be endured. He drew his hand away, and the journey resumed. At the ridge above the river, Atreus pointed to tracks. Human, barefoot. The prints held their shape in the cold, as if impressed by a man who did not trouble himself with frost. The stranger had walked as lightly as a thought, and as carelessly as a storm. Kratos watched the sky while he watched the ground. Men who are hunted learn to count clouds and listen to the motion of crows. He thought of the line that ran through the old stories like a stitch. Prophecy does not chain you. It sets the table and waits to see what you will eat. The Norns carve runes into the roots of the world tree that say what is, and what was, and what will be. Yet every tale of the North is full of choices. Odin chose to pluck out his eye for knowledge. Tyr chose to place his hand in the mouth of the wolf to keep a promise, and lost the hand, but kept the promise. Frigg chose to accept that one thing in the world did not swear an oath, and it was enough to undo everything else. Kratos made his own choice. He would climb to the highest peak, and cast Faye upon the wind as she had asked. He would bring the boy. He would meet what came as it came. No songs, no boasts, no oaths beyond the one already made. They reached the river and stepped onto ice that did not crack. The mountains smoked with their own weather. Far away, a horn sounded once and did not sound again. It might have been only wind in a valley. It might have been something listening and pleased. By the time the river broke into the mirror of the Lake of Nine, the world had widened from grove and hill to something that felt older than language. The lake sat at the navel of Midgard, ringed by cairns and runestones. The water faintly salted with a memory of seas that no map had ever charted. The temple of Tyr rose from its middle like a thought that refused to sink. Its bridges slept. Its braziers were dark. Yet everything in that circle of water carried the hum of purpose, as if the lake itself was an instrument and some enormous hand had just tuned a string. Kratos read the silence in the way a hunter reads snow. Atreus read it in the way a student reads a poem and feels the poet breathe behind the words. They found the witch where the forest leaned over a clearing that held a house beneath the shell of a giant turtle. Its mossy back rose and fell with an unhurried patience. The head craned to the path as if listening for old friends. The air smelled of smoke that knew what it was doing, crushed juniper, and the fennel sweetness that clings to healing rooms. The woman stepped from shadow and waterlight with the calm of someone who has waited a long time and has finally seen what she expected. She spoke to Atreus first and asked about the boar he had wounded, and there was the gentle scold of a teacher in her voice, and the deeper timbre of a queen who has lost more than she will say. She tended the animal with hands that knew how to unmake pain. She spoke of cider, which is Vanir magic that works by coaxing and weaving rather than by command. In the old war between Aesir and Vanir, this craft was traded like a hostage and then stolen back by those who understood that what is woven cannot be ordered to stop. The witch brewed, bound, and blessed. She warned them that the gods of Asgard do not forget insults and do not forgive kindness to their enemies. Her eyes took the measure of Kratos and found what he would not name. Her gaze turned to the boy and softened without losing any of its edge. There are stories folded inside her story like knives inside a cloak. The Vanir queen who owned a necklace bright as sunrise and named Brisingamen, the shape of a falcon that rode the wind faster than a horse can gallop. the mother whose sun shone so brightly that the world mistook the glow for safety. In the lore, the Vanir were keepers of fertility, sea, and sorcery, while the Aesir mastered sky and spear and the loud language of war. The witch spoke as one who has lived at the seam where these ways meet and split. She marked the boy with herbs and good words. She told Kratos that the trail to the mountain was sealed by a breath that is not a mist but a will. To step into it would be to step into the mouth of a night that eats journeys. If they wish to climb, they would need a light that does not burn, a light that persuades darkness to remember it was once only the absence of a candle. Before they could collect such a light, the lake answered a call that had not been voiced in an age. The great temple stirred as Tyr's bridges shifted their old bones, and a horn that had slept under the waves found air. Sound rolled out across the water, as if someone had taken the edge of the world and drawn it around the rim of a glass. The lake rose, then fell, and everything that lived in it fled to the sides. From the deep came a shadow that gathered itself into a mountain that was moving. Scales presented themselves like plates of slate. Ridges curled up into the daylight, and those ridges were teeth. The head that broke the surface was older than the men who first learned to sing. Jormungandr looked up at the small figures on a battered bridge, and the small figures forgot to breathe. In the Eddas, this serpent is born to a mother who waits in ironwood, and a father who is very good at making trouble. Cast into the sea by a nervous pantheon, the serpent grows until it encircles Midgard and bites its own tail, a ring that keeps the oceans where they belong. There is a prophecy that says Thor and the serpent will look upon one another across a battlefield that the sky refuses to see, and that each will be the end of the other. The poets say the water will boil and the air will taste of iron. Here at the Lake of Nine, the serpent simply spoke, and the language bent itself around his voice like branches around a heavy snowfall. Stone trembled as each syllable passed. Atreus did not startle. He leaned forward as if listening for a word he had mislaid. He answered a little, not quite in the same tongue, more a cousin to it, the way a lullaby remembers an older chant. The serpent lowered his head until the gods engraved upon the temple could study their own reflections in one yellow eye. He regarded the boy with the patient interest of a river that has seen cities built and drowned and built again. Then he withdrew enough to be entire without leaving, which is a talent only ancient things possess. The lake felt changed after that, as if one more room had been unlocked in a house that already had too many doors. Dwarves arrived where no path had been yesterday. Brock came first with blue hands and a voice that could sand wood. Sindri followed on other days with clean nails and a list of reasons why no one should ever touch anything that had not been boiled. They were craftsmen in the way that ravens are listeners, which is to say it was their nature. In the sagas, their forebears forged gifts for gods and made mistakes that became features. From the smoke of a forge came the spear Gungnir that never misses, the ship Skidbladnir that folds into a pocket, the boar Gullinbursti who shines enough to light a road at midnight, and the hammer Mjolnir that returns to the hand that threw it. Brock and Sindri looked at the Leviathan axe as surgeons look at an old scar, and at Atreus's bow as gardeners look at a young tree. They spoke of runes like friends. They added small perfections. They squabbled in the way of brothers who would die for one another and will not admit it because that would ruin the fun. With gifts sharpened and allies named, the climb began. The path up the mountain was threaded with old warnings. Carvings showed giants in conversation with storms. Steles recited the points of law that Tyr would have approved. Law that once held all 9 realms in a grip firm enough to feel safe and loose enough to breathe. The wind carried the smell of stone that had just woken and the undernote of something sickly sweet. The witch had named it correctly. The black breath sat across the trail like a king who has closed the hall. It was not weather. It was a decision. It filled the throat and laid a cool hand across the heart until the heart forgot its work. Even the axe seemed to lose weight in the hand, as if the air had decided that metal was not welcome. There are older explanations for such things than curses muttered by an angry god. The Norse speak of boundaries with the seriousness of farmers who know where their fields end and the forest begins. The breath that bars a road is sometimes the will of a dead thing that does not want company. Sometimes it is the last whisper of a ward placed by someone wise who feared what would follow an open door. Sometimes it is the residue of a bargain that nobody remembers, but which still expects to be paid. The witch met them at the place where the breath began, and stood there as if to show the miasma that it could not claim everything. She told them that the cure was not fire or iron, but the light kept by the elves in Alfheim, a light that persuades rather than burns, a light that convinces darkness to move aside by reminding it that it loved stars once. To reach that realm required the map that is not a map, the road that is not a road. Tyr had built a temple that could carry a traveler along the roots and branches of the world tree, which is the ash named Yggdrasil, whose crown shelters eagle and hawk, and whose lowest root drinks from wells of fate and wisdom. The travel room at the temple kept a circle of braziers and a pedestal that asked to hold a crystal filled with directed light. The witch gave them such a crystal and taught Atreus the words that wake it. She spoke of Alfheim as a place divided, where light and dark were not moral positions, but peoples with griefs and grievances. She warned that the light will speak in a voice that makes many promises. She asked the boy to remember that not every promise deserves to be kept. At the lake, the temple opened its bridges with a groan that felt like a winter thaw. The portals along its inner ring glowed with the faint suggestion of other weathers. Kratos placed the crystal. Atreus carried the phrase on his tongue with the reverence people give to names and to doors. The Bifrost gathered itself, not as a rainbow thrown carelessly across sky, but as a beam that knows what it is doing and does not waste itself. The witch watched them with a look that belonged to a mother and to a general. She seemed smaller as the light grew, which is one of the sad jokes of prophecy. Those who know how much a road will cost are the ones who wave goodbye. The temple's travel room received them with a hush that felt rehearsed, the sort of silence that comes before an orchestra lifts its instruments. Runes climbed the walls in braided paths, each sign a promise wrapped in a warning, and the floor was a deliberate circle marked by grooves where the great mechanism had turned for centuries. Atreus set the crystal where the pedestal wanted it, and light collected in the chamber as if filling a vessel that had been waiting to be full. The air brightened without glare. The edges of every engraved letter clarified, while the shadows thinned as though they had been reminded that they are only ever the memory of light. When the mechanism moved, it did not clank. It sighed, which was worse, because it suggested that the world itself wished this journey to proceed. The bridge outside aligned with an impossible door, and the Bifrost gathered its colorless power into something that the eyes sensed more than saw. Kratos placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, and they stepped forward into a brightness that tasted like cold water and sounded like distant chimes. Alfheim received them with radiance that did not warm. The sky was untroubled, a vast pasture of pale light, and the ground was a lattice of roots and white stone, as if a forest had grown from crystal rather than seed. Rivers ran so clear that the fish appeared to hang in the air. Trees glowed within themselves the way a coal glows in a hearth when the last flame has gone. The light elves who glided through this stillness seemed carved from dawn, beautiful and severe, with eyes that held the kind of distance one often finds in saints and in kings. The dark elves moved like shadows that had learned to walk. Their wings carved black arcs in the sky, and their faces carried the dignity of the nightly watchman who knows that someone must tend the hours everyone else throws away. The war between them was without smoke or mud, or the growl of crude engines. It was a war of banishment. Each side sought to deny the other a place under the sun, as if the light of creation were a finite thing that had to be hoarded like winter barley. The light elves fought to pour their radiance into the temple at the center of all paths. The dark elves fought to stop the glare they believed to be a theft. It would be comforting to say that one side was right and one wrong. Alfheim denied that comfort. It offered a lesson that the 9 realms repeat whenever we insist on simple stories. Beauty is not proof of goodness. Sorrow is not proof of virtue. Power is very often only power. The witch had sent them here for a gift that behaves more like a manner of speech than a weapon. The black breath on the mountain would not move for steel or for flame. It would yield only to a light that converses with darkness and persuades it to make way. To reach that light, Kratos and Atreus crossed causeways that reacted to presence as a well-drawn bow reacts to a string. Gateways awakened when they approached and slept again behind them. Creatures rose from the white earth like questions and were answered with frost and iron. Atreus spoke to the stone runes as if they were people who simply wished to be addressed by their true names. The boy read each inscription as one might greet an old neighbor at the post. He discovered that Alfheim is a realm that speaks in poetry even when it is sick at heart. Spirits murmured along the path, voices like moth wings, asking to be remembered, because memory is the only burial some worlds can afford to give. At a narrow span over unwelcome water, they met a captain of the Dark Elves who fought with the intensity of a father who believes his children leave one by one each day. Atreus asked why the light should belong to the other side alone. The captain answered because it must, which is an argument usually constructed on bones. Kratos said nothing. He made a hole in the enemy line large enough for a boy to pass without fear and told his son to keep moving. Alfheim watched them with the unblinking courtesy of a judge. At the heart of the realm stood the light itself, held within a tall vessel that made no beams and cast no rays, but filled the air with an invitation that could be mistaken for a command. The doors to the sanctuary were guarded by those elegant warriors of radiance, and the floor within was a map in stone that recorded the long contest of elf and elf. The light rose from a pool that did not ripple. It recalled the early mornings of the world, before history and after intention, when everything that would ever be had not yet chosen its shapes. Kratos approached with the measured caution of a man who has already paid too dearly for marvels. Atreus stood a little ahead with an expression that belonged to the first time a child hears a song that feels like it was written with his name tucked inside the chorus. The light reached for them the way a story reaches for a listener. Mimir would later call it a cousin to the power that flows through the world tree, a clarity that gathers in certain vessels and is spent in the work of making paths where no paths exist. Kratos stepped close enough for the surface to know him. The light answered with vision and with echo. He saw figures that were not there and heard a voice that belonged to the woman he had loved, a murmur not of command but of counsel. The world whitened, then thinned to something like frost on glass. The axe felt lighter. The scars felt colder. He was about to be drawn forward into whatever lay beyond that brightness when a small hand called him back with more power than any spell. Atreus had shouted, because soldiers of shadow had entered the sanctum, and it is very difficult to argue with the present when the present intends to harm your son. Kratos withdrew, tore himself from the lure as a swimmer leaves a warm mineral spring for rough surf, and he fought with a steadiness that is not rage but memory made into muscle. When it ended, the pool had accepted enough of him to grant what was needed. The boy saw the change in the way the old air around his father now carried a pale glow that answered to thought rather than to command. They left with no treasure that could be weighed, but with a presence that traveled like a second dawn that could be called to hand. The realm did not thank them, and they did not ask it to. On the way to the temple, the war continued without them. Each side sang songs that insisted history would remember the truth. History mostly remembers the singers. The Bifrost gathered them once more, and the travel room let them return to the Lake of Nine, where the air felt ordinary again, and therefore full of possibilities. Kratos stored the newly won light the way a careful man folds a letter and places it close to the heart. The witch's words proved correct at the foot of the mountain. The black breath sensed their arrival and came forward like a dog that has mistaken the world for its yard. Kratos reached without reaching and unwrapped the light within the axe as one reveals a lamp in a shuttered room. The breath retreated at once with a sound that recalled a chain slipping from stone. The path opened not because it was conquered, but because it was convinced. The mountain accepted their intention and postponed its refusal. Higher ground is always honest. It shows you what you must become if you wish to stand upon it. The climb made their breath short and their thoughts long. Wind scoured the face and found the places grief had left raw. Snow sifted into the joints of armor and code. At a narrow pass where the sky felt close enough to catch in your hands, voices floated upon the air that were not birthed by the mountain and not damped by distance. Kratos drew Atreus into the shelter of a stone rib. 3 Aesir stood upon a platform of ancient rock, and every gesture they made suggested that the place had offended them by existing without permission. The slender one who smiled at pain had returned from whatever death Kratos had given him. Beside him stood 2 figures cut from the storm itself. These were men built to be warnings. They spoke of a search for a road that had been shut to them by giants with long memories. They named Tyr with irritation and respect, which are twin signs that a god of war has done his work with a mind as well as with a sword. They questioned the air about a woman whose winter followed her like a cloak. Their words placed Faye among the people who had refused Asgard the courtesy of obedience. Atreus listened and his hands closed into fists, not because of fear, but because of the first taste of how large his mother's life had been. Kratos did not move. He had learned that the most prudent action in a field full of gods is stillness. He allowed the gods to leave with their thunder and followed only with his eyes until the sky had stitched itself closed again. Beyond that ridge was a tree that did not belong to the mountain or to the season or to the quiet rules of growth. Its roots wrapped stone as a snake wraps prey, patient and slow, and its trunk carried the scars of runes that had been burned rather than carved. The face bound within the bark opened one eye and looked upon them without surprise, which is always startling. He introduced himself as Mimir, in a voice that had the practiced balance of a scholar and the sly weight of a confidant of kings. He had been advisor to the All-Father until the advisor had outstayed his usefulness. He had seen treaties made and broken, had poured mead for men who intended peace in the morning and war in the afternoon. He knew where doors had been hidden in older days before fear taught the builders to forget their work. He also knew that the highest peak from which Faye's wish must be fulfilled did not stand in Midgard at all. The place they sought existed in Jotunheim, which is the country of giants and of decisions that age slowly. The trouble was that the giants had closed their borders more securely than any army could guard a gate. Kratos asked what must be done in the way a laborer asks the foreman to point at the next heavy stone. Mimir smiled as a man smiles when he is about to recommend something generous and unpleasant. Cut off my head. Carry it to the witch. Ask her to lend me back the breath of life. The enchantment that binds me to this tree will let go at the first taste of steel. I will be more help as a head than as a stump. There comes a point in many good stories when a request sounds like madness and yet wins the day because it is exactly the right shape of madness. Kratos considered the tree-bound figure for as long as courtesy demanded and a small degree longer. Then he did the work in a clean stroke. Atreus did not flinch. He had seen enough of this world to understand that help sometimes arrives with a wince attached. They wrapped the talking head carefully, and the journey down the mountain had the odd companionship of a scholar who was delighted to be portable and deeply invested in clever conversation. Mimir spoke of the giants and their habit of writing endings and then hiding them. He spoke of Tyr, who had traveled farther than any other god because he preferred treaties to victory and puzzles to decrees. He spoke of Odin with an intimacy that had nothing of affection in it. He called him a collector of secrets who could not endure the idea that any story might be closed to him. The way Mimir told it, The All-Father had broken more promises in pursuit of knowledge than most men break in pursuit of love. The witch's door opened before they knocked, as if she had seen the cut in a dream and had laid out her work table before dawn. She received the head as one receives a wounded friend who has made his own bad decisions and arrives now on a stretcher. Herbs presented themselves in tidy heaps. A silver bowl reflected the light of 3 candles and made a 4th light of its own. The words she spoke were not the brittle jargon of the boastful mage. They were the sort of words that mothers mutter to sleeping children and old priests whisper when they bless tools for harvest. They called back to the body enough of its spark to let the eyes open and the mouth complain. When Mimir coughed and made a dry joke, she finally looked at Kratos without the teaching mask and called him what he was: God. The room cooled by a measure that could be felt. Atreus looked from her to his father with a confusion that belonged to someone who has realized that 2 truths have been living in the same room without speaking. The witch accepted the look and did not answer it. Some explanations have to wait until a mountain has given up a secret or 2. With Mimir awake, she no longer needed to pretend to be smaller than her story. Names returned to her like birds to a glove. Freya said them calmly, as if she had tired of hiding in plain sight. Vanir, queen. Wife once to Odin and enemy now. Mother of Balder, the man with no sense of touch, whose curse of invulnerability had been meant as a salvation and had become a prison. She explained none of this as a plea. She offered it as context for decisions that lay ahead. The path to Jotunheim required items scattered on altars and in bellies, and behind doors that only admit those who know the tune. It required a guide who had been inside the head of the All-Father and had kept enough of himself to tell the tale without flinching. It required a father willing to let his son walk beside him as an equal in danger, and a teacher who would speak when silence would be a betrayal. Between them, they had all of that, though none of them liked the cost. When they left her house beneath the turtle, and the night arranged its stars without ceremony, the road to the highest peak had lengthened and clarified. They did not know that a missing eye would have to be fished from the gut of a friendly serpent, or that an old portal would have to be awakened by tricks of tongue and patience. They knew only that the mountain they had climbed was the wrong mountain, and that the right one lay beyond a border that giants had drawn to keep gods out. The lake received them again, and the temple watched with its usual refusal to be impressed. Above them, a raven crossed the moon and did not circle back. The story had decided it wished to be larger. The cold that greets a man upon his return from wonder is always a little sharper than the cold that sent him out. With the light of Alfheim now bound to thought and to the tempered steel of the axe, the breath upon the mountain gave way like a courtier who has decided to be reasonable. The new path wound through ribs of stone and past old shrines where the gods had been flattered by carvers who hoped flattery might work on gods the way it sometimes works on kings. Kratos and Atreus climbed, with Mimir's head swinging at the belt and adding a running gloss upon each rune they passed, until the living quiet of the height was interrupted by the sort of conversation that has no need of voices. It was the language of footfalls that refused to hide, and the clink of rings on haft, and the lazy crackle of men who have never needed to hurry. Magni and Modi came into view, the sons of Thor and therefore grandsons of trouble. They were not subtle creatures. Their armor was a catalogue of victories. Their shoulders carried the posture of men who have seldom heard the word no. The fight that followed was not elegant. It was northern and near. Stone complained. Ice broke its promise to be steady. The older brother fell with the abruptness of a star that remembers it is only rock, and the younger fled with the look of someone who has learned that the world can become smaller in a heartbeat. Victory tasted of iron and of consequences. Atreus stood very straight after it, too straight for a boy who still needed warmth, and then, without warning, his breath ran away from him, and his body forgot how to be a body. He fell, not as a warrior falls, but as a child does when the string is cut on a toy that was never meant to move without love. Freya received them in the shelter of her art, and examined the boy as one reads a prophecy that has raised its hand in class. She listened to his breathing and to the silence between breaths. She stared at Kratos as if listening for what he was not yet willing to say. Then she spoke the diagnosis that belongs to every myth the North has ever told about names and the cost of hiding them. The boy is what he does not know he is. His flesh is bound to a secret that his mind cannot carry. When the god within a child is not given its name, the body wages a little war upon itself. It is a quiet war, which is the worst kind. This is not an illness from winter or from unclean water. This is the old contradiction. Mortal and immortal bound together, and neither given the courtesy of an explanation. In the poems, such contradictions are resolved by naming and by ordeal. A man who will be king must leap a fire or hold hot iron without flinching. A woman who will be seer must sit upon a high seat and drink from a cup that has never been washed. Here the ordeal required a cure that could only be fetched from a land that does not welcome cures. The heart of a keeper of the bridge in Helheim would draw the poisons from the boy as a magnet draws filings. There was, however, the matter of the axe and of the wind that sleeps in hell. Cold eats cold. The Leviathan would be as useful there as a lamp inside the Sunday Kratos would need a different memory. He went home as men go to a confession they have delayed. The little house made by love and by quiet work received him in the same way a church receives a penitent who is tracked in the snow. He moved the floorboards that had never dared creak in the boy's hearing, and the past rose like a breath that has been held too long. The blades were there in their wrappings, not shame, but something that looks like it from a distance. Once they had been gifts that were really chains. Now they were tools again, and like all tools they asked nothing except to be used with intention. He bound them to his forearms and felt the old heat answer like a hound that wakes to its name. We speak of leaving one world and entering another as if the act can be clean. It seldom is. He left the house as another kind of winter began, one that takes place inside the ribs. The shore of Helheim accepted him without welcome. The realm of hell is not a punishment. It is a conclusion. The myths say it lies beneath one of the roots of Yggdrasil, and that its air is the sort that makes fires nervous. They say the dead here are not the chosen slain whose mead is endlessly refreshed in Valhalla, or the fortunate ones who feast with Freya in her field. They are the old and the unlucky, and the ones whose deaths did not make poets stand up. The road into hell winds past a river called Gjöll that glows with a quiet light, and across it stretches the Gjallarbrú, a bridge covered in gold that never loses its shine because those who cross it do not come back to scuff the gilding. The guardian of the bridge is named Modgud in the stories, a woman with a calm voice who asks who passes and for what reason, and who does not wish to deny honest traffic but will not tolerate lies. In that strange geography there is also a hall that is said to be vast and cold, where the beds are named by their pains and the plates are filled with hunger, because the North knows that the most precise punishments are those that are only mirrors. It was into this clarity that Kratos walked. Bright fire wound around his wrists, breath smoking in a world that dislikes breath. Helheim teaches without asking for students. Whatever you carry that has not been named is given a face and a voice. The old poets knew this when they wrote of Fylgjur and Hamingjur, of spirits that attend a person and of luck that behaves like a creature with its own preferences. Kratos saw a figure in gold that did not belong to these lands. The voice was quiet and cruel in the way that only truth spoken without love can be. He saw another presence like a mountain with a beard, a father who had died by his hand, and the world did not collapse, which is sometimes worse than if it had. The blades wrote their hot cursive across the frozen air, and the dead shrank from that language. He fought the keeper at the bridge, a troll whose duty was to hold the line between those who must not pass and those who must. Trolls in the old literature are not only brutes, they are custodians of border places. Knock upon the wrong door at twilight, and a troll may answer you with a test rather than a blow. This guardian's test was labor and endurance. Kratos answered with both. When the body of the great creature finally fell, he opened the chest and lifted the heart that still remembered its work. It steamed a little in the cold and throbbed once in his hand as if displeased at the change in employment. He returned by a path that was not the path he came on, because realms have their own temperaments and sometimes move their furniture when a guest has overstayed. The Witch Queen received the heart with the grateful indifference of a surgeon who knows that gratitude can wait for the morning. She ground herbs and sang the old syllables and stitched the spaces between life and death with a thread no weaver would admit to owning. The boy shuddered as if a bird had decided to lift from his chest, and the grey came off his face the way shadow lifts when a cloud remembers to move. There followed the moment that Thor with all his storms could not touch, and Odin with all his secrets could not predict. Kratos spoke the truth. He told the boy what he was. He did not dress the truth in poetry. The words lay between them like a length of iron that has cooled after forging. Atreus listened with the bewildered gratitude of a child, told that the monster under the bed is only a word, and with the sudden pride of someone who has been told he is the heir to a house he never knew was his. The body steadied. The mind did not. New strength arrived and asked for things it should not have yet. It is a rule of sagas that when a young god learns his name, he is tempted to believe that the name and the self are the same thing. Atreus began to speak differently. He took steps that landed too loudly upon the ground. He interrupted. He smiled when he should have thought. Lessons that had always gone in quietly now bounced off him as if they were arrows striking a shield. Pride is a spirit that likes to sit at the same table as grief, because pride offers speed and grief offers purpose, and together they make trouble with a plan. Kratos watched this and remembered another life in which he had mistaken strength for wisdom and victory for change. He spoke to the boy in the manner of a man whose vocabulary has always favored verbs over adjectives. He said stop. He said wait. The boy nodded, and then immediately did not. Modi found them again, bruised by fear and by the absence of his brother. In the old law codes of the North, a blood debt could be measured like a sack of grain and called wergild, and there were careful tables for the price of an eye, or a finger, or a life, because farmers know that even grief has to be accounted for if the fields are to be planted next spring. Modi had no interest in wergild. He wanted the crude interest of humiliation paid back with compounded cruelty. He spat words about Fae as if spitting could touch the dead. He spoke to the boy as one speaks to a pup to see if it will bare its little teeth. Atreus answered with the new heat in him. He struck with the easy certainty of someone who has just been told that the world will bend if he leans on it. The blow took the last of Modi's breath and left him on the ground without the dignity of a last sentence. The snow did not care. It went on falling. The father stood over the son and over the body and over the choice that had been made. There is a special silence that follows an avoidable death. It is not the hush of respect or the hush of relief. It is the pause in a story where the teller puts down the cup and looks at the listeners to see who will turn away first. Kratos looked long and did not turn away. He told Atreus that being a god is not a license. It is an argument with yourself that never ends. He spoke of restraint as if it were a tool the boy would need to sharpen each morning. The lesson did not take root as deeply as it needed to, not yet. Pride is a generous fertilizer, and grief is a fine rain. The seedling of arrogance grew another inch before dusk. The journey to the highest peak had acquired a new weight that was not the pack and not the weapons. It was the older weight of father and son learning that love is not only comfort, it is also the slowest and hardest law. The climb resumed beneath a sky that felt scraped clean by knives of wind. Atreus walked with a new quickness that did not come from muscle. He spoke little now, as if the words he might say would reveal more than he wished to know about himself, and Mimir, sensing the thin ice beneath their feet, shifted to the safer ground of useful tales. "There are doors," he said, "that open only when three conditions are met. You must stand in the right place. You must be the right person. You must know the right story." The highest peak of the world was not here at all, but in the country of giants, and the giants, who are not simply tall men but a people as ancient and various as mountains and rivers, had sealed their homeland with riddles. Tyr had once known the answers. Odin had once tried to steal them. In such a contest, the sly man wins the first day, and the patient man wins the last. Mimir told them that a missing eye held the key to one of the locks. He said it in the tone of someone who expects to be believed, because he is prepared to be annoying if he is not. The eye in question had not been lost in the usual way. Mimir had hidden it inside a statue of Thor that had later been thrown into the lake and then swallowed by the world serpent, a chain of events so very Norse that it could only be true. When they coaxed the serpent to rise, he came as mountains come, one after another, until the idea of smallness needed to be relearned. The long body rippled through water older than the runes upon the temple, and that blunt, wise head came so near the boat that Atreus could have reached out and touched a scale the size of a shield. Atreus spoke again in that strange cousin tongue, and the serpent listened with his entire length. He allowed them passage into his vastness. The belly of an ancient creature is less a place than a weather. It hummed with the slow work of taking apart the world and making it into strength. They found the eye clasped like a bright seed among the remains of the statue. There was a sudden lurch, as if the lake had struck the sky. The serpent spasmed and flung them out with a force that scalded the bones. Mimir suggested, through a thread of politeness, that the timing of that convulsion was suspicious. Someone had struck Jormungandr from without. There was only someone who would. Armed with what was needed and walled around by what was not yet spoken, they climbed again. Snow narrowed the world to the steps ahead. At the peak, the mouth of Jotunheim's hidden road yawned with the particular welcome one feels from a locked door that recognizes the right hands. Mimir guided the ritual with the brisk authority of a priest who finally has all the ingredients. The missing eye met its fellow, the runes aligned like soldiers who have had a good talking to, and the bridge that was not a bridge stirred. That was when the stranger returned as if resurrections were a hobby. He came out of the snow as if the mountain had decided to spit out a grievance. The body that should have stayed dead stood very straight and smiled with a gratitude that belonged to a man who has finally found a problem he knows how to solve. He wanted the boy. He wanted the father to watch. He wanted sensation to register upon his own skin the way thunder registers upon a lake. He spoiled the careful work with a single blow, and the pathway to Jotunheim shattered like sugar glass. Then the mountain accepted all of them as offerings, and they fell. Helheim does not love the living. It tolerates them in the way a library tolerates the careless schoolchild who has wandered into a restricted room. The ice below received them with the indifference of an accountant. Baldur pursued across that cold, and the winds raised past lives like moats. The realm has a habit. It holds up a mirror and asks you if you have the courage to look. Atreus saw the weight of his own recent choices, not as accusations but as a ledger that asked to be balanced. Kratos saw his father and the red light of a long sin that had not learned how to fade. Most instructive of all, the realm showed them another history, one that did not belong to them, because sometimes the best way to understand a foe is to watch the roads that led him to your door. In a memory solid as ice, Baldur stood in a clearing while Freya chanted over him. The spell she wove was a wheel. Nothing would harm him. The wheel had a cost. Nothing would touch him. Not pain. Not joy. Not the warmth of a hand. Not the taste of a summer apple. The world would glance off him forever. The small, white thing that Frigg once overlooked in the poems had a new shape in this telling. A sliver tucked upon a boy's quiver. A fix a mother had made with the thoughtless convenience that begins many tragedies. We have already heard the myth where a dart made from that plant ended a golden life. Here the spell did not end a life. It ended the part of living that makes life worth the trouble. The vision closed like a mouth and the wind fell. The lesson had been given. It tasted of ash and milk. Helheim will not let the living keep anything they do not deserve. Kratos and Atreus climbed out of it by earning each step. Father and son learned to speak again without letting pride address grief in the boy's voice. The apology came without ceremony, which is the only way good apologies arrive. Kratos forgave without a speech. And that is the only way forgiveness matters. When they returned to Midgard, the lake was pale, and the temple had resumed its posture of disinterest. The stranger, who now had a name that none of them used because names can be a stage and this was only a battlefield, awaited them with the implacable patience of winter. Freya came also, drawn as any mother would be to the place where her son's voice echoed. She did not bring peace. She brought a demand. Leave him. I will take him, and I will carry the price. She animated the corpse of a giant with her art, and sent that hulking remnant stumbling into the fight, not as a weapon to kill, but as a barrier to stop the blows that would end the only thing she had left. The dead hand of a fallen mason swatted at the living like a clumsy god. The ground pitched and heaved as if rejecting the entire scene. The combat was a conversation between three great truths. Balder wished to feel something, even if it was the pain of his own marrow. Freya wished her son to live, even if that life was an empty vessel. Kratos wished the boy beside him to see a better way to end a story than by making a new orphan. Atreus moved through that storm with a new steadiness that did not come from pride, but from a recognition that cleverness has its uses when strength is busy elsewhere. A blow that should have been fatal glanced away. A spear of ice that should have lodged forever melted on contact with dead skin. Then there was the little accident that was not an accident at all, but the final stitch in a tapestry woven by hands they had never seen. Atreus raised an arm to fend off a strike, and the broken strap of his quiver, mended long ago with a sprig, brushed against the wrong, invulnerable skin. The spell unraveled as a snag runs across a sweater. Baldur staggered. He drew breath with astonishment. He felt a cut and smiled as if the cut were a kiss. It is a strange thing to watch a man rediscover pain and greet it as a guest of honor. He came harder then, filled with gratitude for sensation and with a hunger that had been starving for years. He fought not for victory, but for proof. The proof arrived, and with it, the choice that only a parent truly recognizes. Kratos drove him to the ground. He could have ended the matter in a manner that poetry understands. He did not. He offered mercy and found words to give it shape. Enough. Live as a man, and do not foul the world with more of your noise. Go where your mother can see you, and grow old with the simple sadnesses that make people human. The offer hung in the air with the weight of a full cup. Balder took it in his hand and let it fall. He turned on Freya, and chose to repay a lifetime of her wild love by closing her throat with his fingers. There is a point at which a hand that has killed its share of fathers and monsters no longer asks permission from the conscience. Kratos took Baldur by the neck and broke it with the efficient tenderness of a farmer who does not let a suffering animal suffer longer than necessary. It was not triumph, it was an end. The aftermath was not quiet. Freya's grief filled the clearing like a weather that no one had requested. She laid curses that were also prayers. She named the misery she intended to bring upon Kratos and his boy, and one heard in her voice the old argument between mercy and justice that has never been settled in any pantheon. She did not thank him for saving her life. She called him a destroyer, and she was not wrong. He accepted the names she threw as if they were stones. He gave her a promise, which in these lands is as binding as iron. He would be better. He would choose a different road. He would not let children pay the debts of their parents. It was a small vow measured against the roaring of a mother. It was the only vow that mattered to the boy beside him, is less than Hasson. 3 hash. The road to the giants opened because it had to, which is how the North grants favors. They climbed through the last of Midgard and stepped into a silence so complete that speech would have been a rudeness. Jotunheim was not a place of clumsy colossi stamping around like imbecile mountains. It was a high and spare land with mountains that sat like old judges and valleys wide enough to lay out a story from childhood to burial. The hall where the end of the journey waited had walls painted with a patience that no modern hand can afford. The images told the tale they had just lived, which is the sort of experience that makes even practical men wonder about everything. In one panel, a tall woman with a humor in her eyes and a stubbornness in her mouth was named as Laufey, not Frigg and not Freya. Laufey, who in the older poems is mother to Loki, bore here the simpler name of Fae and the quieter title of mother and wife. The giants had known her and loved her, and laid their trust upon her the way a forest lays its trust upon a river. In another panel, the boy's face wore two names, Atreus, which his mother gave him, Loki, which the giants gave him, not as a punishment but as a role, a name that belongs to those who live between rules and teach gods and men that the story tends to be larger than those who try to own it. Is less than Hasson. 3 hash. A last panel showed a future that Kratos did not share with his son. It showed a father on his back and a son kneeling beside him as if to close the eyes. It suggested grief and obligation and a circle that wished to tighten by one more notch. Kratos lowered the cloth and said nothing. He would rather fight 100 enemies in armor than one possible future on canvas. They climbed to the highest place and opened the pouch and cast the ashes like sowing in winter. Faye scattered into the air of her people, and the wind carried her towards snow and stone. The boy's face altered in the way faces do when the world expands in a single moment. He did not grow older, he grew truer. They stood and did not attempt a lesson, is less than Hasson. 3 hash. When they returned to the lake, the seasons were wrong. A cold laid a white hand over every reed and plank. Fimbulwinter is the long winter the Skalds talk about when they tell the story of how the world ends. It is the great sign that the last act has begun. It begins when a light goes out that should have been tended forever. Baldur's death sent that first gust across the 9 worlds. In the game of causes and effects that gods pretend to understand, some things are simple. A beloved son of Asgard has fallen. The sky takes note. The ravens speak a single word and then shut their beaks. The fishermen pull up nets of ice. The hearths use more wood than they should. Old men repeat the proverb that says there are 3 winters with no summers between, and no one laughs the proverb away. Kratos and Atreus slept that night under a roof that knew the new weight of snow. Atreus dreamed, which is one of the ways a prophecy keeps its manners. He dreamed of thunder that arrived without rain. He dreamed of a giant man standing in the courtyard, the cloak wet with melting frost, the hammer hanging from one hand the way a hawk hangs from a leather glove. The knock on the door was not a knock. It was the sound an ending makes when it coughs to announce itself. The boy woke, and the dream did not leave him. It sat beside him like a large dog and stared at the door. The father lay awake and watched the shadows shift, as if they were charts for a sea he would have to sail. What came next belonged to another chapter and another appetite for disaster and repair. But for a breath they lived inside a small, hard peace. They had kept a promise to the dead. They had broken a curse that had been mistaken for a blessing. They had stepped from the old habit of vengeance toward the new practice of being better. Fimbulwinter came like a decision. It settled upon Midgard not as a storm to be waited out, but as a season that had lost its memory of spring. The lake withdrew into a hushed oval of ice. Pines spoke in the brittle language of frost. Wolves stitched the white fields from tree line to tree line, and their pads made no sound at all. The Skalds speak of 3 great winters with no summers between, a long narrowing that starves cattle and patience alike, a signal that the last act has been called to the stage. Somewhere in the bright cold, the sky chasers Skoll and Hati ran their endless circuits after sun and moon, and each day the light seemed a little dimmer, as if one of the wolves had at last gotten a piece of its prey. Within this hush, a father and a son learned the geometry of shared rooms during a season that would not end. Atreus had grown into a limber restlessness that could not be blamed on youth alone. He read shrines the way a locksmith reads doors. He listened for giants as if the wind might confide in him. Kratos, who had once trusted only the answers of iron, now practiced the slower answers of care. Together they trapped for meat, mended lines, and spoke seldom of the dream that would not stop knocking. The knock came when the sky was the color of hammered pewter, and the air tasted of snow that had not yet chosen a place to fall. It sounded once upon the door, and then again upon the bones of the house. On the threshold stood a great man who brought weather with him. Thor is a name that even children know without stories. He drinks deep, loves hard, strikes fast, and carries a hammer that returns to the hand that throws it. The old poems say his goats pull his car across the heavens, and that he eats them and blesses the bones, and they rise new again. A party trick fit for a god of thunder who never learned to do things by halves. His beard held ice. His eyes held a tired fury that had been busy for years. Beside him stood the All-Father, the one who traded an eye for a drink from the well of knowing, and who hangs himself upon the world tree, in the tale that explains why words sometimes arrive like birds that have flown a very long way. Odin wore authority the way other men wear wool. Hugin and Munin were not perched, but their absence felt like presence. He spoke in the practiced quiet of a sovereign who has discovered that power does not require volume. The offer he brought to a small home smelled of mercy and read like a contract. Leave off your search for the Norse god of war. Return to your winter. I will ask the queen with falcon eyes to let her vengeance grow dull, and I will ask my son to keep his storms at home. Hand over the boy when he wanders into matters too large for him. There are many ways to avoid a war, and my way saves everyone trouble. He set the words upon the table as if they were hot bread. They cooled very quickly under Kratos' stare. Thor asked for a different language. He wished to measure the Spartan in the old style. The yard became a hall without walls. Breath turned to smoke and lifted between them in little banners. Thor swung his hammer with the casual certainty of a man who has never wondered where his next victory will come from. Kratos met him with the patience of someone who has learned to count to 10 before the blade lands. They moved the world a little with each exchange. Frost cracked. The cliff remembered it was a cliff. Thunder unfurled and rolled down through the frozen carpentry of the trees. This was not the savage path of the younger Spartan. It was the careful argument of an older man who has decided that the shortest road to victory is often a refusal to be hurried. When they finally broke apart, the score could not be written with numbers. Thor looked at Kratos and found admiration buried under the cinders of wrath. Odin looked at both and found that words would have to serve for now. The All-Father took his quiet leave. The hammer god followed, trailing a promise that felt as much like a hope as a threat. A house once visited by the Aesir is no longer a house. It is a harbor with its lights noted on enemy charts. Kratos and Atreus left the woods to the snow and carried their few things along the hidden paths that the dwarves keep in their pockets. Brock and Sindri received them into a dwelling set between places, a little impossible architecture that borrowed space from the roots of the world tree and returned it with interest in the form of comfort and stew. Dwarves in the tales are not small jokes. They are the older brother of making. They give shape to awe and to plans, and even their quarrels are kinds of craft. In one story, two dwarven smiths wager their heads against Loki's pride and make marvels for the gods. From their firebeds come the hair of the goddess Sif, a boar with golden bristles who lights the night as he runs, a spear that always finds its mark, a ship that sails in any wind and folds into a purse, and a hammer that shakes mountains and never forgets its master. The old names for those smiths are Eitri and Brocker. Here the brothers were simply Brock and Sindri. Blue-handed gruffness and immaculate worry. a partnership that had already repaired more than steel. They knew the politics of the realms like good innkeepers know the feuds of their patrons. They had heard rumors in their vents and pipes. The Aesir had taken much. They had taken a god and packed him in iron and dark. The name of that god still carried an older dignity. Tyr belongs to law, to oaths, and to battle understood as a last resort rather than a first impulse. In the tales he lays his hand into the mouth of the young wolf Fenrir to bind a promise. When the wolf cannot break the magic fetter that the dwarves have woven from impossible ingredients, the beast bites and Tyr loses the hand, but keeps the promise, and the world sleeps a little easier for a time. He once walked the roads between realms not as a conqueror but as an envoy, laying down the old weapons of pride and raising up the harder tools of exchange. Finding such a god seemed a better plan than any bargain that could be struck in a winter yard. So Kratos agreed to a hunt that was not for deer and not for glory. The clues led to Svartalfheim, which is a realm of hammer songs, sour steam, and tunnels that have learned to think in straight lines. The ice of Fimbulwinter had not softened its furnaces. Gondolas creaked along chains older than some empires. Water flowed that should not have flowed and stopped where it should have moved, because the Aesir had stepped into the dwarves' works and altered the tempos to suit their own marching feet. They walked through a city that had been told to look busy for its captors. Dwarves glanced up and made everything into a shrug. Gear is a craft too, and the small folk here were masters of it. Brock and Sindri worked levers with the proud resignation of men who will do a reckless kindness and pretend it was a practical choice. Atreus moved as if the stone itself answered when he spoke to it. Kratos lifted gates by remembering where old strength lives. They found the prison where walls had learned how to insult. The cell that held Tyr had not been built to break a body. It had been built to bend a spirit. A gaunt figure looked up and flinched from nothing. There was recognition in his look when he saw the boy. Not of features, but of pattern. The sense that the story had taken an unexpected turn that might yet lead somewhere worth walking. They cut him loose, and he stood with the careful joy of a man who must reacquaint himself with balance. He refused weapons. He refused to be hurried from caution into anger. A god of war who has seen too much will sometimes choose peace with a stubbornness that feels like a challenge. Tyr spoke softly about rooms where maps once covered every wall, and about roads that worked only for the courteous. His hands shook when he smelled fresh air, but he kept the tremor from his voice. Back at the little wayhouse between worlds, the presence of the freed god did not settle the argument that had been growing in the quiet between father and son. It complicated it. Atreus had collected scraps of prophecy the way a crow collects bright things. He had his mother's shrines and the murals of Jotunheim in his head. Loki had become a word that no longer meant only the old trickster who gives birth to monsters and to miracles. It had begun to mean a boy with a bow and an education in riddles. Kratos distrusted every line carved in stone that dared to tell him who he must be. He had already lived under the whip of someone else's story. Mimir sat upon the table and poured oil upon none of the fires, choosing instead to recommend that they seek out the truth of a seer who had once outwitted the All-Father in a matter of world-ending importance. There stood in Alfheim a shrine to Groa, a witch of great repute who in one tale sings spells to free the hero Svipdag, and in another lends Odin lore at a price he does not enjoy paying. Her final vision had concerned Ragnarok itself, and what perishes when it breaks upon the world. They travelled again to the realm of light and its shadow, not upon a tourist's errand, but as scholars who understand that a single page might undo the need for 10 battles. Alfheim had changed since their last visit. The long quarrel between its peoples had burned away some of the reserve and left a raw honesty. The sky no longer pretended to be innocent. The temple of the seeress kept its sanctity despite the scorch marks of argument. Groa's prophecy stood in carved panels that had been saved from the All-Father only because she had lied to him before he could seize them. The lies were not small. She had told Odin that Ragnarok would devour all the realms and leave a clean slate upon which he might write again with whatever pen he stole next. Here the old stones said otherwise. The end is a surgeon rather than a butcher. Asgard burns. The other worlds endure. Out of ruin a guide will rise and gather the scattered into a new order. The word champion did not ring with the hollow metal of flattery. It sounded like a job that would get a person killed and would be worth it anyway. The boy read and saw himself named without being named. The father read and saw another cage. The finding of a pacifist god and the reading of a careful prophecy did not settle the matter of what the family should do on the next frozen morning. It informed the argument. Atreus pointed to mercy as a strategy and to knowledge as a weapon that leaves no blood upon the snow. Kratos insisted that prophecy is only ever a suggestion masquerading as a command, and that the only clean victories he had ever known were those in which he refused to be rushed by another person's fear. Tyr could be a teacher or a burden, and at that moment no one could say which. Alfheim gave them no blessing when they left. The temple of Tyr at the center of the lake resumed its watch without telling them where to look next. Odin was working his own variables, and would have preferred that the boy accept the invitation to Asgard that hung in the cold like a low star. Thor polished his rage and told it to wait. The realm doors cracked open and shut on their hinges of light, and the little house between worlds filled with the smell of broth and wet leather and unspoken plans. Ironwood did not open with a roar. It parted like a curtain that has remembered how to be courteous. Atreus found himself standing in a forest whose trees wore a private light, a soft green that collected in the seams of bark and in the cupped hands of leaves. The air had the smell of steamed birch and wet soil, and there was a hush that belonged not to fear but to attention. This was a hidden corner of Jotunheim that the giants had folded away when they locked their borders, a little conservatory of futures yet to be planted. He did not come there by map or by permission. He came as if the world had decided to escort him along a service corridor that only reveals itself to those names that are on a certain list. The first thing Ironwood gave him was a companion. A girl stepped from the underbrush wearing the ease of one who is at home in her story. She said her name was Angrboda, and the name brought with it echoes from the poems. Echoes of a woman who in the old verse keeps a house in the iron wood, and who bears children to Loki that are not like other children. In the Eddas, she is associated with wolves and with omens, and with the idea that history occasionally makes a family out of everything the gods fear. This Angrboda had the mild confidence of a keeper and the patient sadness of the last librarian. She did not flinch when Atreus said that some call him Loki. She did not swoon as if meeting an omen. She poured water from a wooden ladle and asked if he wished to see what his mother had asked her to keep. What she showed him were rooms of quiet labor, baskets filled with smooth marbles that were not marbles at all, but vessels for what remained of the giant people when they could no longer afford to be caught in their own skins. The magic is not a trick, it is a sympathy. A soul can be coaxed to sit in a shell if sung to correctly, and if given a promise of return. Angrboda had been given this charge by those who trusted her more than they trusted fate. She placed one of the little globes in his palm, and the weight of it was surprising. It pressed the hand like a memory. Then she led him to a wall that had once been alive and was still trying. The mural bloomed across it in mineral colors, a patient narrative of events that had already happened to him and a few that had not. In one panel, a father and a son walked beneath a sky that looked at them with mixed feelings. In another, a witch queen knelt in a field of grief. Then came a frame that felt like a hand closing. Kratos lay on his back with snow clinging to his beard, and Atreus bent over him with a face that had learned how to lose. Prophecies in the north seldom shout. They nudge in a voice that seems to be your own. The boy stared and felt the peculiar dizziness of seeing a future that might simply be the shape cut out by fear. Angrboda watched him with sympathy that did not mistake itself for authority. She said that Faye had known of the painting and had broken a panel to confuse the All-Father and his ravens. There are many ways to fight a prophecy. breaking the frame is only one of them. Ironwood offered smaller mysteries as well. Atreus found a little snake whose body was failing at the business of living. Its breath was thin. Its eyes had the faraway look of a creature already partly elsewhere. The girl suggested, not with ceremony, but with the matter-of-fact kindness that knows its tools, that a waiting soul might help it along. He pressed one of the marbles against the faintly beating scales, and the fragile thing drew in a longer breath, as if it had just remembered a larger body it used to own. Later, the world would meet a serpent in Midgard who knew languages older than weather, and who could look at Thor with something like recognition. For now, the small snake coiled around the boy's wrist, and the wrist knew that something important had occurred. Angrboda then spoke of the old wolf who would one day swallow a sky, of the daughter who rules the hall below with a dignity that puts kings to shame, and of the great serpent who girdles a world. In the lore, these are the children of Loki and the woman of Ironwood, and the poets give them the gravest of duties. The wolf is prophecy given teeth. The queen of the dead is necessity given a face. The serpent is time learning to hold its own tail, so that seas do not run away. Atreus listened and did not try to force the map to fit his own footsteps. It is the beginning of wisdom to let a story be larger than you are. The way back to Midgard closed gently behind him like a book that has been lent and returned in better condition than it left. While the boy had been talking with a future written on bark, the father had been bartering with an old and reasonable hatred. Freya had hunted Kratos across the snows with a patience that would have won any siege. When he finally caught her arrow and laid it gently aside without drawing blood, they spoke in a low voice that wasted nothing. She said that the oath she cherished most was the one that promised vengeance. He said that he would help her break the chains Odin had placed upon her in Vanaheim so that she could travel freely and then choose what to do with her freedom. The Vanir realm received them as kin who have quarreled for so long that even the trees have learned to eavesdrop. Vanaheim is a green tangle of rivers and moods, a place where cedar was first braided, where spells do their work by asking and by aligning, rather than by shouting. Freya's brother Freyr had taken up the leadership of those who resisted Aesir footprints in their gardens. In the myths, he is lord of sun and rain, owner of a boar whose bristles carry light, rider of a ship that can be folded and carried in a pocket. He is the sort of god who proves that abundance is a discipline rather than a mistake. To remove the curse Odin had laid required errands that smelled of damp earth and old iron. They entered holy groves that did not welcome strangers. They salved stones that had been taught only to carry and never to be comforted. They confronted spirits who remembered Freya as wife and as prisoner and were not sure which memory deserved to be called true. Kratos did not try to teach. He did what he has learned to do when brute force is wrong and patience is right. He held fast, he lifted when asked, and he spoke of his own past with an honesty that cost him something each time the words left his mouth. In the telling that Freya heard there were no boasts. There was a man who had killed a father and known the emptiness that follows triumph. There was a husband who had once failed to keep a home whole. There was a soldier who had mistaken obedience for virtue and duty for love. The confessional was not an excuse. It was an offer to place experience on the table so that another suffering parent might eat from it and grow a little stronger. The curse loosened its knots. The Vanir queen felt the first draught of freedom and did not pretend that the draught had the scent of forgiveness. She pledged her vow to the work of ending Odin, and she laid aside her obsession with killing Kratos in the yard of his own son. They returned to the Dwarven Wayhouse with an alliance that had been earned in the manner of good harvests. It had required time and belief, and the acceptance that weather does not answer to anyone. Atreus watched all this and felt the tug of two truths. The first is that a prophecy which mentions your name will not let you rest. The second is that parents can be both shelter and obstacle without changing their nature. He had seen a mural that expected him to mourn a father. He had held in his palm a secret community of giants who looked to him as a shepherd. He had been called Loki by a girl who spoke the word as if it were a tool rather than a sentence. And now Odin himself had invited him to visit the halls of Asgard with promises that sounded like keys. The All-Father dresses control as kindness the way a clever thief dresses as a priest. Yet he also possessed the knowledge that might prevent a death and avert a ruin. The boy argued, carefully at first, and then with the urgency of a drumbeat that will not be silenced, that he must see for himself what the old liar wanted and what he feared. Kratos refused with the stubborn clarity of a man who has paid every hidden cost listed in fine print. The argument moved from room to room like a winter draft. It did not shout. It returned each evening and sat by the hearth. The choice, when it came, did not announce itself as a grand act. Atreus left a note that promised he would return and slipped out along a path the dwarves had not thought to hide from him. The realm door opened upon a sky that wore gold-like armor and upon walls that had grown from enchantment and from the certainty of men who think they will never die. Asgard did not greet him with spears. It greeted him like a schoolmaster who sees in a new student both a prize and a threat. Thor weighed him with a look that admitted the existence of mercy, without endorsing it. Sif observed with the narrowed eyes of a mother who has already made the list of injuries done to her family, and now looks for a way to end the list. A young woman named Thrud planted her feet as if she had decided to become her own weather, and Odin opened his hand with a grandfatherly smile that would have made a barn cat purr. The All-Father spoke of a mask that could peer beyond the curtains of the world and of cracks in reality where answers pooled like rain in a low place. He said that together they could so shut the rip that would otherwise swallow a sky. He said that all he wished from the boy was his help, and that he would keep Kratos safe because the story would be so much easier if everyone stayed politely alive. Back in the little house between the realms, Kratos stood very still and felt the absence of his son the way a veteran feels, a changing barometer. Freya counseled action without panic. Mimir recommended the wisdom of those who know how to look behind the stage and see the hooks and ropes. The wolves outside the window lifted their voices once. Not in hunger, but in recognition. The war that had watched and waited had now reached in and taken a piece from the board. The father looked to the road, and then to the place where his son had last slept, and the room felt like a shrine that had misplaced its god. He made no speech. He gathered what he would need to make choices, when choices were offered by an enemy. The vow he made was spoken so softly that only the walls heard it. He would not allow prophecy or fear, or the friendly cruelty of Odin to decide the measure of his love. He would go where he must. He would be patient where he could. He would pay whatever price did not cost the boy his soul. Asgard rose from the cold like a boast-made stone. Its walls sheened with enchantment, its halls lined with trophies that were as much warnings as they were decorations. The air itself felt curated, crisp and bright, and edged with the smell of forge smoke and applewood, as if someone had commissioned a season that flattered the eye. Atreus stepped beneath archways carved with scenes of victory that refused to ask who paid for them. Thor watched him with the patient contempt of a storm that has decided not to strike yet. Sif measured him without moving, the way a hawk measures the space between its perch and a rabbit. Thrud appeared like a spark struck from flint, open-faced and eager to test herself against any obstacle that looked tall enough to be interesting. Then Odin arrived with a smile that belonged on a favorite grandfather and a gaze that belonged on a thief. He spoke gently about curiosity and choice and the burden of prophecy. He showed Atreus a splintered mask made from no wood any tree would admit to bearing, a device that he said could frame the tear that ran through reality like an unhealed scar. Knowledge pooled at that wound, he whispered. Answers to every secret and thread of fate. Would the boy help him find the missing pieces? Would he, Loki or Atreus or whatever name pleased him today, walk the halls and the realms and bring back truth in the shape of mask shards? The invitation felt like a key offered with both hands. the boy learned the local weather quickly. He ate in a hall where Einherjar set down spears to clap the backs of comrades who had already died once and were happy to practice for the next time. He sparred in a courtyard where Thrud moved with a cheerful ferocity that made him think of rivers in spring. He walked the high ways with Thor, whose laugh could be an avalanche or a lullaby, depending on how much ale had just left the jug. He listened, while Sif prayed the quiet prayers of a mother who has lost and is determined not to lose again. He worked under Odin's eye in a study packed with ravens and relics, where the All-Father polished words until they reflected back the face he most wished to see. This was not the raw cruelty of tyrants who cannot be bothered to lie. It was the subtler wickedness that feeds a boy flattery and calls it freedom. Atreus accepted the tasks and hid his purpose inside obedience. Mask fragments lay in Muspelheim's ash and in Niflheim's breath and in the corners of memory where only the stubborn or the foolish dare to hunt. He gathered them with a thief's caution and a son's haste, telling himself that the more he knew, the less likely the painting on the wall in Ironwood would ever come to pass. There was a journey that Odin said could be handled by the boy alone, a simple errand to the cold country below all roads, where a mask shard clung to the iron light of Helheim as barnacles cling to a drowned plank. Hell is not a punishment in the older poems, it is a housekeeping. Those who did not die by blade or heroism find their rest there under the rule of a queen whose dignity outshines many kings. The dog who keeps the gates is named Garm in certain lays, perhaps a cousin to Fenrir, perhaps the same creature seen from another angle, a great hound whose howl is said to shake the marrow of armies when the last battle begins. Atreus found not a dog of legend chained to a mythic stone, but a colossal wanderer, gnawing at the fabric that separates places. Garm tore openings without effort, casual as a bored child tearing paper, and the dead spilled through like dust shaken from a rug. The boy acted from the softest part of his heart. He cut the chain because chains make decent people angry. In doing so, he gave freedom to a creature who did not know how to live without chewing the world. That error belongs to almost every saint's early career. He ran, clutching the shard, while hell reshaped itself around the new calamity. Events elsewhere were moving with the colder logic of those who read patterns for a living. In Midgard, Kratos sought the Norns as a man seeks carpenters after discovering rot in the beam above his bed. The Norns are not simply three old women at the foot of a tree, although they are also that when it suits them. They are the habit the world has of recording itself. At the Well of Erd beneath the root of the world tree, where the water tastes of beginnings and the swans are white as the first snow, they answer questions with the weary precision of scholars who have already annotated the margins twice. Kratos did not ask if he could be spared. He asked what would reach for his son. They answered with the name of Heimdall, the watcher who hears grass grow and sees the twitch in a thought before the thought calls attention to itself. In the older songs, Heimdall stands at the bridge of the rainbow with a horn that will empty his lungs to call the end. In this story, he stood already half inside tomorrow, with a hand stretched toward Atreus's throat. To kill such a watcher with ordinary tools would be like trying to stab the wind. The Norns told Kratos to find a thing that had already proved it could multiply itself. They said the word that names a ring that drips other rings every 9th night, a small waterfall of gold first laid upon a funeral ship. Draupnir would become a spear if given to the right hands. The right hands for making were the brothers who had given a shape to half the wonders of the north. Brock and Sindri received the ring with a glance that said both, "It is an honor and this will be a nightmare." Dwarven craft is a conversation between stubbornness and talent. They took Kratos to a place in Svartalfheim where the world's first heat still remembers the day it learned to cool. In the presence of the Lady of the Forge, who does not speak and has no need to, the ring learned to spit forth points as sharp as decisions, each tip a copy of itself, each ready to be born with a gesture and to die with another. The spear took a temper that was not merely steel, for Kratos poured into it an oath that he would not be hurried into old sins. While the metal sang, Brock stood a little apart and looked smaller than his quarrels. The lady watched him with eyes that knew more than mirrors. She revealed, without words, what Sindri had never confessed in full. The blue-handed smith had been pulled back from death some years ago, at a cost measured in fractions. A piece of him never returned. A man can work without that piece, even laugh without it, but he cannot travel the last roads where souls go at evening. Brock took the news in as practical men take in the sight of a broken axle. He grunted and tightened the straps on the task he would carry anyway. The spear cooled and remembered the name of its master. When a mistake grows legs and runs across realms, you either chase it or learn to live in a house that leaks. Atreus came reeling back from hell with eyes full of torn sky. Kratos met him without scolding, because there are times when a father must decide whether the lesson should go into the bone now or be saved for a day when it can be carried without breaking the back. Freya joined them with the swift competence of a queen who has set aside revenge for the moment and taken up more immediate salvations. They descended to hell by paths that disagree with the living, and found the wolf loping through rent after rent, content in the way of a creature that has discovered a simple joy. The boy understood in a rush that pity without thought is a kind of cruelty. He called out, and the wolf did not listen. He spoke magic, and the wolf answered with teeth. Then he remembered that a life can be moved from one vessel to another if the vessels are chosen with care. He cut his knife in the air and placed its point against Garm and whispered to Fenrir, the friend who had died in their yard at the start of winter, the companion whose absence had left the sound of emptiness under every bed. The soul that had waited in the blade leapt like a spark to dry tinder. The vast beast paused, shivered, and then regarded the boy with a sober recognition that did not belong to a mindless terror. Garm was gone. Fenrir stood, immense and newly awake, the same and not the same, a memory given muscle. He tore no more holes. He guarded what he had torn with the gravity of a gatekeeper who has taken an oath. Scholars of the Elder Songs have argued for centuries about Garm and Fenrir, whether the Hound of Hell is only a second name for the wolf who will swallow a sky, or whether they are cousins who share a taste for endings. Here the argument folded itself into a boy's act of mercy corrected into wisdom. Hell healed slowly. The rents closed like eyelids. Quiet returned with the reluctance of a guest who is not convinced the party is over. They climbed out by stages, father and son speaking now with the easy economy that comes after a shared labor well done. Kratos did not praise with many words. Atreus did not apologize with many either. The lesson had settled. Odin watched the repairs from a distance and altered the speed of his smile by one notch. The All-Father would offer warmer words now. He would insist that the mask be completed quickly before another mistake complicated matters. He would promise safety for the father and genius for the son. He would ask only for cooperation, which is a tax particularly enjoyed by tyrants who prefer to be loved. Meanwhile, Kratos weighed the spear that could be summoned with a thought and chosen with a breath. Heimdall had a habit of standing where doors narrow. He had a talent for predicting the first inch of a thrust and the direction of a flinch. Against such a watcher, surprise is a ghost that rarely shows itself. The spear born from Draupnir did not need to surprise the eye. It needed to confuse the future. Each lunge could become many. Each feint could seed the air with points that waited for a word to bloom. Mimir approved with the relief of a tactician who has finally been offered a lever long enough to move the stone that blocks a road. Brock watched Kratos practice and spit a few jokes through the ache that now held his chest. Sindri polished and clucked and pretended not to stare at his brother, because grief often arrives before the body that will warrant it. Atreus returned to Asgard with the face of a student who has learned more than his teacher expected and less than the lesson demands. Odin ushered him to the Great Rift, an absence that made the air smell thin and the brain feel tall. The mask pieces fitted together with a little click that sounded too domestic for what it promised. Thor grumbled about the taste of fate on the back of his tongue. Thrud stood near and tried to learn what both older men were failing to understand. The boy held the mask and saw at the edge of the tear not answers but a hunger that wears the clothes of certainty. He thought of Angrboda's careful eyes, of Freya's vow, of his father's sparing hand on the throat of a god, of Fenrir lowering his head to receive a soul that had been kept for him like a bowl kept warm on a stove. He thought of the snakes that devour their tails, and of the dogs that bark at the doors of halls below the ice. He thought, and in thinking he moved one step closer to the understanding that would make the next day necessary. The road that leads to a Watcher is the quietest road of all. It winds through Vanaheim's thick greenness, where vines learn the names of travelers and pretend not to know them. It crosses black water that keeps its reflections to itself. It climbs a shoulder of stone where the wind keeps old secrets in its pockets. At the crest stood Heimdall, bright as a polished coin, golden-eyed, and faintly smiling in the style of a man who has already read tomorrow's news and does not think much of it. The old poems give him 100 keen senses and a hearing so fine he can catch the sound of wool growing on sheep. They place him at the Bridge of Colours with the mighty horn that wakes the last morning. They call him the whitest of the gods, which is the Skald's way of saying he is clarity given flesh. In this story, he also possessed the terrible advantage of contempt. He had looked into many futures and learned a common lesson. Most men, when the blades begin to talk, repeat themselves. Kratos came to teach him a different grammar. The spear born from a ring that makes other rings answered the palm with an eagerness that did not show. Dwarven craft always holds back a little, the way a clever host never lets a guest see the kitchen. Kratos tested the points that blossom where none were a moment before, and the trick of planting a sliver in the air and calling it back with one rescuing word. Heimdall flicked aside the first rush as a man brushes away a moth. He read the second and the third, and replied with a cuff that would have caved a wall. He spoke through a smile about dogs and their owners, and about the noise of mortals who cannot accept their smallness. He tried to provoke the boy. He tried to provoke the father. Atreus steadied himself with the memory of Hel's cold and of Fenrir's warm eyes. Kratos steadied himself with the memory of a life spent sprinting toward anger and of the emptiness that always waited at the finish line. He fought without haste. The spear multiplied decisions. Heimdall's foresight tripped over choices that were not there a heartbeat before, and then were everywhere at once. There is a moment in any duel when disdain cracks. It had the sound of ice fissuring across a river at first thaw. The Watcher snarled and reached for power that bends air and thought. The spear found him then not as a miracle, but as the result of study. It pinned his arm to fate, and took from him the poise that had always been his favorite garment. Kratos closed, and did the cruelest kind thing a soldier can do to an enemy who will not stop. He finished it with a finality that refused drama. The old ballads would have enjoyed a mutual fall, a neat exchange where Watcher and Trickster end each other in a blaze of symmetry. Here the symmetry failed to appear. Heimdall died in the snow, and the horn that wakes the world came away in Kratos' hand with the weight of a verdict. He did not sound the horn. He wrapped it in the thought that an end must be chosen and not stumbled into. Yet even unsounded, the instrument changed the air of the camp. Mimir looked upon it with the sad respect owed to a prophecy that has been picked up like a heavy tool and set upon the table. Freya laid a palm upon it and withdrew as if from a hot stove, for she could feel in its shape the plazas of Asgard burning and the orders shouted under a sky that had decided to crack. Atreus watched his father and understood that some decisions would be made with him, and some would be made despite every effort to keep him safe. The boy returned to the halls of the All-Father with the mask nearly whole and a new caution in his voice. Asgard received him with the crafted warmth of a host who is keeping an eye on the silver. Odin smiled, the thin smile of a man who has scented the approach of a deadline. He guided the boy toward the rift that hummed in his chamber like a hive. The mask pulled at Atreus's hands like a tide at a swimmer's ankles. Within the tear there was not golden certainty, but a pale hunger that wished to swallow questions along with answers. "Loki," spoke Odin, and he made the name into a key and a leash at once. "We are so close now. Give me the pieces, and I will give you a world without funerals." The boy held the mask a little tighter and thought of Ironwood and of a mural painted by patient hands who wanted not inevitability but warning. While the All-Father rehearsed his gentleness, another drama unfolded far from his eye in the small home, between places where the kettle knows the measure of every grief. The rescued god who called himself Tyr had been a shadow for days, tall and hesitant, always asking to leave the room when plans began to congeal. He spoke in riddles about doors and in platitudes about peace. Even his silences felt edited. It was Brock who finally let irritation do the good work that patience had neglected. The dwarf's blue hands were scarred with the old proofs of honest labor. He watched the tall god shift and equivocate, and he squinted as if trying to focus on a figure behind a veil. "Whose side are you on?" he said in the uncomplicated dialect of men who hate lies. The answer that came back was wrong by a fraction, the kind of slip that would pass unnoticed if the listener were hoping. Brock was not hoping. He walked up and spoke the boy's other name, and the god winced as a courtier winces when a coat is tugged in public. The room changed shape. Odin stood where Tyr had stood, the disguise falling away with the ease of a hawk shedding rain. The All-Father had always loved information more than loyalty, and now he took the most immediate information from the room by sliding a blade into Brock as if taking a sample. It was a small motion with a harvest of ruin. The dwarf staggered and held to the table with fingertips that had steadied so many tools. Sindri screamed a single syllable that had in it all the hours of laughter the brothers had ever shared, and all the work they would never finish together. Odin had the courtesy to look regretful for a heartbeat before he vanished through the nearest secret like a rat departing a larder on fire. There are griefs that arrive with the gravity of a planet. They bend every orbit in the room. Sindri's face closed like a door. The hospitality vanished from his voice and from his house. He who had once sniped and fussed and fed and fixed became narrow and bright and edged, a chisel where a spoon had been. He did not blame with fairness. He blamed with accuracy. Atreus felt the words enter and remain, little barbs that would not be pulled out by time. Brock lay still, and the silence that followed did not belong to peace. It belonged to the emptiness that appears after a craftsman dies and leaves unfinished work that will never find the last polish. The camp lowered its flags, then it raised different ones. An end had chosen them. Their only courtesy left was to choose how they would meet it. The choosing required a fire older than starlight, and a giant who remembers how to hold it. They walked the black fields of Muspelheim, where the ground is a crust over a patient anger, and where the air shows heat from a long way off. Surtur was there, ancient and weary. A power folded into the shape of a person as a sword is folded into a scabbard. In the songs he strides at the last with a flaming blade and lays the heavens open. The details around him blur in the poems because men tend to look away when whole skies burn. In riddling lays there is a woman named Sinmara who keeps a weapon of runes and demands impossible payments for a glimpse of it. She is flame given a calm face. She is the seriousness of endings when they decide to stand up and walk. The plan they proposed to Surt was an act of sympathy as much as of war. They asked him to become the event rather than the person, to take into himself a union with the one he loved, and in so doing shed the boundaries that kept him smaller than the catastrophe required. It is a strange mercy to ask a being to become a disaster so that the disaster can be aimed. The rite did not look like a rite. There were no trumpets. There was a memory of tenderness between beings who do not need words to praise each other. There was a binding of embers with a name spoken over them that no human throat could quite repeat. There was the placing of a heart where a heart had once lived, and the acceptance of a loss that had been agreed long ago in conversations too private for any skald to transcribe. Surtur swelled. The horizon behaved badly. The sword that is not merely metal, but the statement that metal makes about the world lifted. Muspelheim breathed, and the breath was fire. Somewhere far away, a raven roused with interest, and then took shelter in a sleeve. Kratos watched the birth of the giant who would give his name to the last night, and he did not look away. Atreus stood with his mouth closed, and his eyes open, and learned that some powers are not overcome by strength, but by agreement. Freya whispered a prayer for the souls who would be in the path, which is a prayer every queen learns to keep near the tongue. As plans hardened, the realms answered in their various styles. Alfheim sent light that agreed to be aimed for a single day. Vanaheim sent archers who could persuade vines to move aside and then to bind again with malice. Svartalfheim sent machines that were honestly ugly and perfectly useful, and a toolkit of grudges that could be put aside for an afternoon. Helheim growled acquiescence through the throat of a great wolf who had learned the meaning of his new name. Jotunheim stirred in small ways that no one could point to, and yet everyone felt, as if mountain windows had been opened after 1,000 winters. Midgard gave men and women with stubborn hands and a few old charms that have always worked best when no one is watching. The dead Valkyries of memory returned to their queen with the shaky dignity of veterans who wish to try again. The shattered families of Asgard shuffled their feet and looked at one another across rooms where Odin's shadow had always sat at the head of the table. Thrud touched the hammer that would one day choose her and asked it, not for power, but for purpose. Kratos moved through this assembly with a stillness that no longer came from rage. He spoke little, and people listened because they had learned that he did not squander words. Mimir provided the mortar, telling jokes where jokes would keep a seam from cracking, and reciting a fact where facts would keep a blade from slipping. Freya became general and mother at the same time, a combination that makes armies capable of restraint as well as courage. Atreus walked between groups and practiced the art that will someday be the only art left to us, the art of making strangers nod to one another as if they have shared bread. When night fell, which is a theatrical way of saying when the tasks of the day had run out for a few hours, father and son sat in the courtyard where frost still held the stones in a light bite. They did not speak of the mask or of the rift or of the prophecy that had once set its chill hand on a painting. They spoke, instead of the first time a bowstring felt right under a child's fingers, and of a woman who knew both giant songs and small house songs, and who had arranged for a funeral and a journey in the same breath. Then they slept the kind of sleep that is like lending your body to someone trustworthy for a little while. And in the morning, the horn waited on the table like a final exam. Dawn did not so much break as bow. The sky lowered its bright crown and listened while a single note gathered itself inside a horn made for endings. Jalahorn met Kratos' breath and answered with a sound that knew the roads between worlds better than any map. It rolled out across Midgard and then into places where light changes its manners. It touched Alfheim and turned every shard of crystal into a bell. It passed through Vanaheim and drew the vines tight like bowstrings. It startled even Muspelheim's fire into attention, and it spoke to Hel with the courtesy one gives to a queen who does not kneel. There are calls that summon armies with promises of loot, orphans with promises of bread, and kings with promises of immortal lines in poems. This call asked only for nerve. Doors opened where no doors had stood a heartbeat before, and what walked through them was not an empire. It was a collection of vows. They gathered beneath Asgard's wall, the one that had stared down centuries without blinking. Light elves arranged themselves in wheeling ranks that made shadows move like lace. Vanir bowmen stepped into glades that had been coaxed into the very stone, beside mages who spoke to the air as if it were a friend recovered after long absence. Dwarven engines clanked in a key that promised trouble, their housings scored by 1,000 repairs, and their insides tuned to the song of stubborn minds. The dead from Hell marched in good order, behind a towering wolf whose eyes held a household's loyalty. Giants awakened from marbles and from memory, shoulders like hills, fingers careful as schoolteachers. Men and women from Midgard stood among them with iron at their belts and old charms stitched under their collars. Freya lifted her hand, and the Valkyries returned to her with the chastened splendor of veterans who have seen enough to judge themselves. Mimir spoke in a quick stream that would have been jest in any other hour, and now served as balm between strangers. Atreus walked the line of faces and said little, yet he kept finding the eyes of soldiers, and then giving those eyes a reason to stay steady. Kratos looked upon the wall that had once been a promise, and was now an obstacle. He did not need to say aloud that a promise which holds only the Maker safe is no promise at all. Asgard did not feign surprise. The All-Father had counted ravens for this moment and stacked contingencies like coins. The Einherjar formed in ranks as neat as a merchant's ledger, pale and tireless, shield to shield. The ground shook with a familiar thunder, and the gate swung inward for a god who never sneaks. Thor strode out with Mjolnir crooked in his fist and grief hidden behind his teeth. Above the wall, the new queen of the Valkyries, Gnar, traced killing lines in the sky with a retinue that could turn midnight into hail and noon into knives. Odin appeared as only emperors dare to appear, not armored, not afraid. A gentleman collector, stepping into a gallery to inspect an acquisition that refuses to sit still. He told the world to be reasonable. The world selected something else. The first blows wrote no poetry. The wall spat fire and the allied lines soaked it up with grim discipline. Elven spears hurled bright swarms into the towers, and dwarven shot bit out visible chunks of masonry, yet the face of Asgard held. Kratos led a push that was not about glory, but about finding the next yard of street a child might one day run across without fear. Freya broke a line with a single arrow, and then sealed the hole behind her with a word that coaxed the earth to become careful hands. Atreus moved where the binding was weakest, a boy to any casual glance, and in truth a seamster of battle, stitching between companies, mending a break with a crisp instruction, unpicking an enemy feint with a remark that sent a captain where he needed to be. Then the lake of air above them bulged as if something old had rolled over in its sleep. The world serpent arrived. Jörmungandr's head came up like a coastline. His scales were a geography lesson. His breath carried salt and thunder and the long patience of currents. In the poems, he rises on the day that ends days, and meets Thor in a hatred that is almost respect. Each is the measure of the other. Here, in a field not made for such guests, the serpent coiled along the bastions and stared down the god of thunder. Thor leapt as if the distance between sky and ground had never mattered to him, and the hammer struck with a sound that taught stone new ways to grieve. The serpent's tail sheared towers as easily as a man knocks seeds from a stem. Lightning danced along ancient scales, and the air itself buckled. Somewhere in that exchange, the world lost its balance for a breath, and time behaved like a rope pulled sharp. The serpent went out of the present as a fish slips from a net, not dying, not defeated, simply elsewhere. Skalds would later say that the blow sent him backward along the deep stream of time, and that was why the creature always seemed older than memory. Thor landed with his shoulders squared, and the rage that had fed him for years flickered with a doubt that tasted like ash. On the ground, the battle turned on a small gentleman who had decided he was finished being polite. Sindri arrived in a storm of sparks and sorrow, and drove a dwarf-made ram into the wall, with a technique that had nothing to do with finesse and everything to do with refusal. The barrier cracked. It cracked again. The third bite took the heart out of it. Asgard's face, so long serene, showed surprise in the oldest way a face can. It bled. Through the breach poured elves firing sun through narrow streets, and Vanir hunters who never lost their way, even in a city built like a story told by a liar. Dwarves unfolded machines that did one thing each, and did it perfectly, making mute corridors where enemy formations went to forget themselves. The Einherjar faltered under this collage of tactics they had not rehearsed for. Sif looked across a square and saw children being herded to safety under the eyes of men who had sworn to protect them, and were now being told they were only accounts in a ledger. Thrud judged her father's house and found it guilty of being smaller than it should have been. Mother and daughter crossed the tile and chose their own work. Kratos and Thor met among the splinters of a hall that had once held oaths like fine china. The first exchange was thunder on muscle. The second was a lesson that even thunder can learn. Kratos did not aim only at the body. He aimed at a story. He spoke to a father who wore his guilt like a chain. He invoked a daughter whose eyes deserved a better legacy than intoxicated victories. He pointed, with a few stark sentences, at a door marked different from the one marked later. The hammer drifted lower by inches. Thor breathed as if air had come back into fashion. Surrender is too grand a word for what he did. It was a pause. It was the dangerous beginning of a man not obeying what he had always obeyed. Then a spear found him with surgical malice. Odin stepped from behind an idea and put his weapon where it would do the most poetic and the most practical harm. He killed his son because mercy threatened his accounting. He killed him because a pen that does not serve must be snapped. The hall took the sound and folded it into itself. Thor fell with a surprise that was not fear, and Mjolnir thudded once like a heart refusing its cue. The All-Father turned to the enemies he had cultivated and smiled with all his good teeth. He invited them to despair. Kratos did not oblige him. Freya did not oblige him. Atreus did not oblige him most of all. The last fight began without drums. It is one thing to face a warrior whose strength you can see. It is another to face a hoarder of secrets, whose favorite art has always been to stand just to the left of truth. Odin bled knowledge from runes that had previously refused to cooperate with anyone. He split the air and walked through the slit. He belted a curse on the room so quickly that language had to chase it to keep up. Kratos matched him with the steadiness of a man who knows that the one thing an enemy cannot steal is your decision to keep moving. Freya matched him with spells that did not dominate the world but invited it to remember his crimes. Atreus matched him with the mask that the old thief wanted more than sleep. The rip in the study's air widened as the pieces clicked together, and for a dreadful instant the boy saw what Odin had promised, a shining reservoir of answers, a lake with no shore, the end of every why. Then he did what good tricksters do when confronted with a trap that has been set for someone else. He refused the premise. He broke the game. He turned the mask's hunger inward and collapsed the promise into a shard that cut only the one who had wanted it. The All-Father faltered. Kratos took him down not with rage but with insistence. Freya bound him the way a mother who has learned discipline binds a feverish child, firmly, lovingly, without apology. Atreus took an old lesson learned from a girl in Ironwood and folded it around their enemy. Odin's soul was coaxed into a vessel the size of a palm. It pulsed, an ember in glass, a mind shouting with the conviction that it was still the room's owner. There are many courts of justice. There are juries of peers and of gods and of geese and of public opinion. This judgment belonged to a brother who had been asked to weep once too often. Sindri stepped from the smoke with his grief dressed in work clothes. He took the stone from the boy with hands that had built wonders, and then built a final mercy. He shattered it upon the floor. The sound that followed was not dramatic. It was ordinary. It was the click of a lock that has finally broken and can no longer hold. The sky made its decision. Surtur, who had been waiting with the patience of mountain fire, rose to his new height. He walked, and the city bent like wheat. Now the poems found their footing again, for here was the giant with a sword that sings fire, and here was the end of a golden house. Asgard cracked and flared, towers coming apart like bad arguments, streets turning to rivers of light that had chosen to go downhill. Freya held back the tide with a courage that had nothing to do with fame, and everything to do with giving his sister and her friends 4 more breaths than they would have had. The Allies did not win a victory that could be framed in a hall. They made an escape that could one day be told to children without lying. Portals flowered as fast as hands could lift them. Kratos carried those who stumbled. Freya counted heads with the economy of a woman who has waited for the count to come out right for decades. Atreus looked back once and saw a realm become a caution. The last thing that fell was a sky that had served a king too long. When the survivors stood again on honest ground, the horn lay quiet on a table, and the world had entered a room it did not know. The air tasted of ash and relief. Grief moved from face to face, taking attendance. The work of endings was done. The work of beginnings waited where it always waits, in the next small choice and the next clean word. After the fire came a quiet that did not belong to victory so much as to survival. Asgard was cinder and memory. The sky over Midgard wore a thin ash veil, and the air had the taste of coins and rain. The living gathered on honest ground and began the oldest work, which is counting who remains and deciding what to build next. Freya stood with shoulders squared and eyes steady, a queen once more. The Valkyries returned to her not as instruments but as sisters. Orders became requests. Punishments became amends. In Vanaheim the groves exhaled, and in Alfheim light and shadow learned to share a border without claws. The dwarves sealed their engines and opened their doors for mourners. Sindri did not join them. Grief had closed him into a small, hard star, bright and untouchable. No one blamed him and no one tried to soften him. There are sorrows that must keep their teeth for a time. The real Tyr was found at last where the All-Father had hidden him. A quiet figure wandering among ruins in Niflheim with the careful steps of a man relearning the shape of the day. He bowed to Kratos and to Freya, and when he spoke it was with the voice of a judge who prefers mediation. He walked out into the 9 realms with empty hands and a promise to listen before he spoke. Sif gathered the families who had escaped the burning city and asked them to choose a life rather than a rank. Thrud came to the hammer and lifted it without triumph. She vowed to become not a storm that breaks roofs, but a weather that waters fields. In Hell, the great wolf stood watch at the healed seams, and the dead resumed their quiet tasks under a queen who keeps good books and shows kindness when kindness is due. Kratos and Atreus climbed once more the step of a shrine their hands already knew. Angrboda met them with a look that had both welcome and farewell. She led them to the fragments of Faye's hidden mural, and the room felt like a house that has finally been aired. In paint and mineral dust lay the truth that Faye had worked to unwrite prophecy, not out of fear but out of love for choice. Another panel waited in a narrow alcove, one that Kratos had not seen. It showed a man who was once terrible standing beneath garlands and lanterns while strangers reached out to touch his hands. A god of war who had become a god of something gentler. The hard face crumpled and did not care who saw. Mimir, who has words for every hour, had none for that moment and was content to be quiet. Atreus made his own choice with a steadiness that surprised even him. He would go with Angrboda to find the scattered giants, the people who had trusted their souls to marbles and to secrecy. He hugged his father the way a young tree leans into an old one during a gust and then stands straighter. They spoke simple promises. Keep safe. Write on the wind if you must. Return when the road is ready to return you. Angrboda smiled with the private confidence of someone who has already read this page and liked it. They left by a path that did not trouble the grass. Kratos did not follow. He turned instead toward the work that had waited under all the fighting. He walked with Freya through villages where the roofs wore frost and the people wore fear thin as cloth. He learned the names of old debts and set about cancelling them with his hands. He lifted beams. He carried water. He taught men who wished to be brave that bravery is patience made visible. He taught boys who wished to be gods that the best glory is a full harvest and a winter without funerals. The Leviathan axe found new uses. The blades that once burned with rage learned to cut rope and not throats. The spear remembered that it could plant as well as pierce. In time, the face on the hidden murals stepped into the open day. There was a funeral for Brock that smelled of forge smoke and river stones. Dwarven prayers do not aim at the heavens. They speak to the workbench and to the anvil and to the first spark that ever left the first fire. Kratos stood far back and did not intrude. Sindri did not look up. One day he might, and one day he might not, and both days would be allowed. The army that had been cobbled together from vows and grudges became neighbors. People who had only ever met on battlefields learned to argue about bread and bridges and taxes, which is to say they learned to live. In the evenings, Kratos climbed the steps of the temple and spoke with Mimir while the lake mended its old mirror. They talked about Tyr and whether law can be kind, about Freyr whose courage had purchased time for strangers, about Thor who had almost changed and perhaps had changed enough to move his daughter's heart. They talked about how the end of the world had not been an end at all, only a stern invitation to grow up. Sometimes the wind out of the north brought a whiff of birch and wet stone, and the faintest rattle of marbles in a wooden bowl. Kratos would close his eyes and smile with the private certainty of a father who has chosen trust and intends to keep choosing it. When spring finally remembered its appointment, the first crocus showed itself beside a scar in the earth that no longer smoked. Children ran there and did not know why their parents watched with tears. The story did not finish. It changed tense. A god who once broke worlds now keeps them. A boy who once asked for answers now goes to ask better questions. The 9 realms breathe. The wolves keep to the forests. The ravens gossip about smaller matters. And somewhere a giant serpent turns in the deep and dreams a dream that will become a tale when someone is ready to listen.